And I am your host, Ray McBary. Welcome back to the Georgia First Show right here on the new Channel 22. And one of the organizations that I have personally been a member of for more than a decade now is the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Of course, we live in a day and time in which when you say Confederate anything, those people who are not native Southerners, immediately it throws up red flags and they say, what is that? What's that all about? As though it must be some nefarious organization or something with an ulterior motive. The truth of the matter is that the Sons of Confederate Veterans is one of the oldest heritage organizations in America. It's been around for more than 100 years, and it's one of the most honorable, noble organizations that I've ever been a member of. It actually does a tremendous job in educating people, not only here in Georgia, but all across the country every year in many different ways about American history and heritage and Southern history and heritage. And it's an honorable organization I've been proud to be a member of for quite some time. Joining me here on the show today, though, is a good friend of mine who is also a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, Mr. Bill Lindsay. Bill, thank you for being on the show.
Thank you, Ray. I'm just delighted to be here.
Well, Bill, it's good to have you on the show. You're an attorney in the Barnesville area, and you also are the commander of the Barnesville Blues Camp of the Sons of Confederate Veterans in the Barnesville area. And of course, our coverage area includes not only Henry County, but Butts County and Lamar County as well. So I'm hoping that there may be some people watching the show today that are within driving distance of where you meet there for the Barnesville camp. And hopefully we're going to give some people some information today that they did not already know about the Sons of Confederate Veterans. So let's start with this. What is the Sons of Confederate Veterans?
The Sons of Confederate Veterans is, as you've mentioned, it is a heritage and history organization. It's been around for scores and scores of years, since really the early part of the 20th century. The SCV, in short, Sons of Confederate Veterans, really is an offshoot of the original group, which was made up of real Confederate veterans. After the war, several years after, the soldiers and the veterans on both sides, both the North and South, started forming veterans organizations that were very active, and there were huge numbers of Northern soldiers and Southern soldiers who joined their respective groups. The Northern side was called the GAR, or the Grand Army of the Republic, and they had reunions for many years thereafter. Well, the Southerners were no different in that respect. They had reunions for many, many years, and they were widely attended. Thousands of these rapidly aging veterans would go to these reunions, and they kept their local units going too. But then as years passed and they got grayer and older, the next generation took over. It was their sons, with respect to the Southerners, who took over and formed an organization that we now know as the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Now, with the passing of years, there are very few sons left. There's a sprinkling of them still left.
That's been a long time ago.
It's been a long time ago. And now we are the sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, and so forth on down from these veterans. So it has lasted a long time. Its purpose, though, is basically what it's been for over 100 years when it comes to the SCV. It is to remember the Confederate soldier so that he will not be forgotten. That, among other things, the various camps will decorate graves, will maintain grave sites. In particular in the South, as most of us know, most all little towns have Confederate graveyards. And in this particular area, that's certainly true. Not just because almost all the men had been in the Army and then died later in passing years, maybe 50 or 100 years later even, but also those who were killed during the war or died during the war. So in this particular area, because we're close to Atlanta where some severe fighting took place, a number of these cemeteries have lots of men who were killed or died in the fighting in this area. And that certainly includes Barnesville and Milner, where there are many men buried who were killed in the fighting in the action in the Atlanta campaign. And Griffin and other points northward all along the rail line that actually leads from Atlanta down to Jonesboro, Griffin, Milner, Barnesville, Forsyth, and thence to Macon. So we have extra reasons in this area from that standpoint to to be aware. But more than that, the idea is to help us remember and to teach our children what it was about, and to not let what I suppose we today call the mainstream media trash our ancestors. And we want them to be remembered for the way they really were, and the honorable men
Right.
and women that they were.
Well, and that's one of the things in the world today with, well, let's just face it, to the victor belong the spoils. And after the war was over, most of the textbooks were published in northern publishing houses. Still are today, I guess, as far as that goes. And so really the Sons of Confederate Veterans is the only historical or heritage organization that is still giving the southern side of why the war was fought. Of course, you pick up any Yankee textbook, it's all going to say that the entire war was about slavery, and that's all you're going to hear, period. That's it. But it really was about much more than that, wasn't it?
Certainly was. When we look back and look at facts and look at the way things were in the early 1800s and up until the time the war started, it's really hard, I think, for people today to get a grip on what things were really like in the South and the North too, for that matter, in any number of ways. The overwhelming reason and subject that arises always in the textbooks and in popular history too is the matter of slavery, which everybody, of course, recognizes was a terrible scourge on the entire country for many, many years before the war. One thing that the SCV would like, and I think history buffs in particular, will be to realize that scourge, as I call it, this wicked institution, was not a mere Southern institution. It was
Right.
a national
That's right.
institution. And up until really the end of the war, the various states that had this institution had gotten, most of them, at least the northern ones, had themselves abolished the practice not too long before the war broke out. So,
Right.
for example, the state of Pennsylvania, up until 1847, that was the last year that slavery was legal there. Why? Not because of the federal government, but because the state government took the actions that were necessary.
Right.
And that had not happened in the South. And whether it would have happened, I don't know. I think it probably would have if another few years had passed. But the point I'm making is that issue and most other issues at the time were considered to be state matters, not federal or national government matters. And today, that's hard
Right.
for most people to grasp. That in the popular mind today, I think it's true that most issues tend to be solved in Washington or addressed in Washington.
Mm-hmm.
But in those days, that was not the view, and not really the legal view. The
Right.
legal view, and even today, the legal view is that most all issues are state-level issues and should be addressed by the state governments and the citizens of the respective states, and not the people in Washington.
Well, that certainly is what the Founding Fathers said. They incorporated that, enshrined it in the 10th Amendment, states' rights or state sovereignty. And it's interesting to see how events today, even in the political world, discussion has come back around to those same topics today because we've got a federal government that, again, seems way beyond what our Founding Fathers intended. So today we're having the same discussion, really, that our Confederate ancestors had in 1860, because the only way to rein that in constitutionally is for the states to do it. So we're back to having this same discussion of it being up to the states to guard the people's liberties. But let me get back to our subject about the organization here. The Sons of Confederate Veterans, first of all, you've given us a little bit of the origin and the history there. The organization itself meets in local camps. Tell us a little bit about the structure of the Sons of Confederate Veterans.
This is like many other organizations that have state and national organizations. We're similar in that respect, like Kiwanis or Rotary or many other Elk or whatever, in that in our particular group, and I'll start at the bottom and go up. A typical setup is like in our county, in Barnesville, in Lamar County, is the local camp or club, as it would be called in other groups. Is called a camp because that's a military type term. The commander, which I happen to be in this particular case, I don't really command my men or the ladies who are
Yeah, I was going to say,
auxiliary.
I know some of the men in your camp. I'd like to see anyone try to command them to do much of anything.
It would be like herding cats, I'm afraid. But in any event, just because it is based on veterans, we try to keep the organization to at least sound like a veterans group. So
Sure.
from our camp, from Lamar County, and our friends in Upson and Griffin and the various other camps, they answer to a higher level, which is at the state level, and that's called the state division. And then it goes on up to headquarters, which is the national headquarters, and people who are officers there have, instead of president, vice president, secretary, and so forth, we say commander, lieutenant commander, adjutant, and so forth.
Yeah.
But it's not to say that we're run like a military organization. Far from it. It's like any other volunteer group. So you have all sorts of people from all walks of life. You have in a camp, and I'll take mine as an example. You have people whose primary interest is doing battle reenactments, where they dress up in the uniforms and fire muskets, but not with live ammunition, so nobody gets hurt. And
Everybody likes to watch a reenactment.
everybody loves that, and I do too. And you run from that level to the folks on the other end who don't care anything about wearing the uniforms or smelling the gun smoke, but who love history and who love to read about battles or about politics or about historical figures. And then you have everybody in between. And so, and some camps have almost solid reenactors. Other camps are strictly history buffs and don't care a thing about reenactments. Others are a mixture, like our camp tends to be. And so there's room for everybody. They're old and young. The youngest that's allowed legally, at least by our Constitution, is age 15, and then the sky's the limit. They're members in their 90s, although
Wow.
not in my particular camp. So there's room for
Well,
everybody.
Bill, let's do this. In 60 seconds or less, tell me, why did you join the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and why should someone else watching this show consider joining?
I would say the bottom line is, number one, if you're a Southerner and you want your Southern history to be remembered the way it was, you cannot count on the history books to do it. You better teach your family and your friends and your compatriots in
Right.
your local community. And what better way than being a member of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, and spread the word in that way. And then when we pass on, it'll pass on to our children and those who come after us, because this is an active, viable organization that will be around for a long, long time. And in particular these days, we happen to be right during the 150th anniversary of the war, or the sesquicentennial. And so that has helped to renew interest across the country in this entire subject. It certainly has with a lot of people in my camp.
Well, Bill, thank you so much for being on the show. When we come back in just a minute, we're going to talk to someone else from the Barnesville Blues camp, one of Bill's friends and someone who is also an officer in the camp. I think you're going to enjoy what you have to hear, but as Bill has already pointed out, we're celebrating now the 150th anniversary of the war between the states. What a wonderful time for any Southerner looking to commemorate your family's part in Southern history and Southern heritage to consider joining the Sons of Confederate Veterans. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back in just a minute.